I don't know about you, if you enjoy getting ready for the Christmas holidays. I was an ornery kid when it came to Christmas because my mom and dad always said that the presents that I got from them were from a man in a red suit. But I knew that those presents, we didn't have a chimney in Florida. So I knew the presents didn't come down a chimney. And I knew my folks had bought presents. And I was on a mission from basically the day after Thanksgiving to find wherever the stash was. My parents had a little pop-up camper that they kept in the garage. And so when it was closed down, there was just like a Dutch door that you could kind of crawl into it. And I had been so good at finding presents in their closets and in the attic that they stuck them under a compressed pop-up camper. And I don't know what possessed me to open up that door and find this entire stash of presents. But I got to the point where I had my little pocket knife, and my mom would wrap presents the minute she bought them because she knew that I was looking for them. And I remember one Christmas, I took my pocket knife and I sliced the tape on the edge. You know how you fold it up over the edge and you tape it. And I sliced it right there, and I opened it up just a little bit to see if it was a plain box, I knew it was closed. But if it was Legos, I'd see whatever it was, or Star Wars, or G.I. Joe, or Transformers, all those really cool toys from the 80s and 90s. And then I would fold it back up and put tape right over it. Well, I don't know how I got outed. It was probably had something to do with my sister. But from that point, because I told her what she was getting for Christmas too. But from that point on, my parents engaged in a psychological warfare campaign that was called deceptive packaging, where they would pack my Christmas presents inside boxes, inside boxes, inside boxes, because they knew if they didn't do that, I was devious enough that if they didn't triple pack it, I might find out what my Christmas gifts are before I actually got them. And so, along those same lines, I've kind of engaged in the same things occasionally with my family. The gift might be this big, but they're going to get a box this big, so they can't possibly guess what it is. I'm giving you a wallet or a set of earrings, but it looks like it's a new car, And so I don't know if you enjoy that, or you can appreciate the desire sometimes to kind of find out what's going on, what's all wrapped up. And one of the things that I love about the Christmas story, and especially as we look at Luke chapter 1, is how sometimes there is a gift within a gift. One of the things that's amazing about the story is in Luke 1, Luke has a slightly different perspective on the birth of Christ. He includes a few extra stories that we don't find in Matthew. We certainly don't find in Mark or in John. And in this story, one of the things that God does is he provides a gift in his son, but along the way, he provides gifts to people in need that are all part of his plan, and is just a way for God to be uber generous and just to bless. And so this morning, we're going to look at Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 25, to see this gift within a gift, that God is so generous with his giving that is part of his plan and is part of his way to bless the world. He also blesses a couple that finds itself in a challenging situation. So as we look at this passage, there's four things that are important that I think are helpful for us to reflect on. Let's start by looking at the importance of history in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Follow along with me as I read God's word. Luke introduces his gospel by saying this: "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught." Well, that's a really wordy introduction. What does it mean? Well, one of the things that I would note about verses 1 through 4 is you don't notice this at first blush, but it's very technical language that Luke uses. People don't really realize this about Luke. They just think he's one of the disciples, one of the apostles, one of the people associated with Jesus. He actually wasn't. He wasn't one of the 12 disciples. Luke was trained to be a physician. So he was the beneficiary of the best that first century education could offer. Many regard Luke's Greek is the finest Greek that you find in the New Testament. And that's certainly the case in verses 1 through 4. It's very precise. It's very technical. And the point behind this, talking about Luke's education, might not sound like the most important thing, but it goes into his theory of composition. One of the things that he talks about here, what might be minimally important for you, is the care with which Luke wanted to write history. I think sometimes there's the perception, and this might not be you, but it is people outside the doors of the church, that when they hear the word gospel, they associate the word fable or tale with it and not true story. And so you can see in verses 1 through 4 how Luke is trying to snuff that candle out very quickly. He's saying that he's concerned about the process of writing history, what we call historiography. And so in his introduction to this man Theophilus, which means friend of God, we don't know, is that kind of a stage name? Was there somebody really named Theophilus? There seems to be a historical person. Some people, kind of the leading theory, seems to be that there is a patron who is paying Luke to actually write this, to do his own version of the gospel story. And so Luke, as a doctor, begins to examine things. He says that he cites many other works. He interviews eyewitnesses and explores eyewitness accounts, and that he very carefully and considerably researches what he writes to give certainty to someone who has heard the story but goes, yeah, but is it true? Is it true? And Luke says, hey, there are many others that have written things. There are many that have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished from us. There are eyewitnesses. There are people that delivered the word. And it seemed good to me, having followed all things closely. Luke is almost saying he's writing a research paper and he is citing every possible precedent literature he can find. I think one of the reasons that Luke writes the way that he does, Luke is tracking Mary down to have conversations. Luke's the only one that includes Mary's song in Luke chapter 2. Well, where else do you think that Luke got that? He went to the primary source material. So kids who are in school, who maybe just had to write research papers before the holiday break, Luke is demonstrating that he's doing good work. He is exhaustively tracking down eyewitnesses, comparing written sources, and very carefully tracking, he said, all things considered to this, so that he can put together an account for somebody who says, man, I like the story, but is it true? Or is this just a fable? Is this just a religious tale? And the point that he is making is that this isn't a fable, this isn't a tale, this is history. So I don't know who needs to hear this morning. But I think one of the things that Luke is trying to emphasize here in demonstrating the importance of history is that our faith is unarguably historical. So if you will not find anyone but the most strident and insolent atheist who would say, yeah, the gospel story is completely fake, Jesus didn't exist. They're not being honest at that point. You cannot employ skepticism to Luke's gospel at the very least. Because Luke says he researched. He went to eyewitnesses. He's researched other sources. He's been very careful, and he's explored every avenue that there is to write history. And so you may doubt the interpretation of history, but you cannot doubt the existence of Jesus Christ. You may not think that he's God in the flesh. You may not think that he was born of a virgin. You may not think that he was resurrected from the dead, but you can't explain away on a historical basis the fact that he existed. We can go toe-to-toe on apologetics and who Jesus was. But Luke is trying to demonstrate here that this is not just wishful thinking, sweet bedtime stories for kids. It is history, and it is concerning the life, the teaching, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. That's an important thing for us to stand on, that we stand on a faith that is historically verifiable. Well, his whole purpose is not just to defend the process of writing history. He tells us a story, and it begins in verses 5 through 17. And he introduces us to a priestly couple, Zacharias and Elizabeth. And I want you to hear their story in verses 5 through 17. Again, you'll see his concern for history because verse 5 starts like this. In the days of Herod, king of Judea. He's rooting it and grounding it in historically verifiable people. In the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah. And he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord. But they had no child, because Elizabeth was barren, and both were advanced in years. Now, while he was serving as priest before God, when his division was on duty, according to the custom of the priesthood, he was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense. Then the whole multitude of the people were praying outside at the hour of incense. And there appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And Zechariah was troubled when he saw him, and fear fell upon him. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard. And your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son. And you shall call his name John. And you will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great before the Lord. And he must not drink wine or strong drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit, even from his mother's womb. And he will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God. And he will go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready for the Lord a people who are prepared." Well, we've noted that he's grounding what is happening in the days of Herod's kingship. He introduces us to this ideal couple. They are a picture of piety. Now, the thing that is interesting to note is, as Luke's gospel opens, there has been 400 years of silence from God. At the closure of the Old Testament period, God seems to have just disappeared off of the scene. There has been no prophet. There has been no word from the Lord. And in that meantime, many people of the nation of Israel became what we would call secular. They held on to some of the traditions. They participated in the festivals, but their faith didn't really make a difference in their day-to-day life. Not so with Zacharias and Elizabeth. There's this ideal picture of faithfulness for Zacharias and Elizabeth, despite the fact that God had gone quiet. And in this passage, we see at least two very real concerns that Zacharias and Elizabeth had. The first is personal disappointment. It is noted that despite their godliness, they are doubly childless. Number one, it says that Elizabeth was barren. By the way, they were both advanced in years. That's a really nice way to saying that if they go to the doctor, they're going to a gerontologist. They're old. They're beyond. Even if she had not been barren, the body doesn't work quite the way it's supposed to work anymore. They're beyond the opportunity for this. And childlessness was a major source of shame. But their personal disappointment was also joined with spiritual concern for their nation. Again, 400 years of silence. They had been disobedient. God had gone silent. And they're in this period where they're wondering if God has forgotten his people. Has God changed his mind about his promises? Is God going to be faithful to what he has said? And yet, despite these concerns, their personal disappointment, their spiritual concern for their nation, they are patiently faithful. They believe God. They see very little evidence of his work. And yet they are patiently faithful. Look at how they're described. They are called, where is it here? They're called righteous before God, verse 6. And they were both righteous before God, walking, meaning their course of life, their manner of life, was walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord. So they were, please note this, righteous before God, blameless in their behavior before other people. These are the kinds of people that if you think your godliness is a determination of whether your prayers are going to be answered, these are the kind of people you assume their prayers will be answered. Righteous before God, blameless before others. These are the kind of folks that you pull for, that the things that they wish for, you want to be answered because they are godly. We root for them. They're the home team. And yet, in the context of Luke describing who these people are, you see this, what we would call Christmas story, begin to emerge because the story continues. It just so happens that they both happen to be from priestly lineage. We don't know exactly what lineage Zacharias comes, but he's a priest. We do know that he might be a Levitical priest or a Zadokite priest. We know specifically that Elizabeth comes from the priestly line of Aaron. So a lot of times when we think about priests in the Old Testament, we just think Levites. Well, there were Zadokites and there were Aaronic, not ironic, Aaronic, people from the line of Aaron. And so Elizabeth is a kind of a priestly daughter from the line of Aaron. Zacharias is of the division of Abijah. We don't know necessarily what line that comes from. But we're told that there's 24 divisions. Abijah is just one of them. And they had a calendar by which these 18,000 priests divided into 24 divisions. Each division had 2 weeks that they served in the temple. And so 18,000 priests divided by 24, I am not about to do math in public. You don't want me to do that. You've got a lot of people. And then it says that by lot, meaning they cast a die to see, they did paper, rock, scissors to figure out who was going to be the person to go in and offer incense before the Lord. And so incense was gums, woods, resins, that when they were spices, that when burnt, made they would create like not steam, but smoke, and they would have a pleasant smell. So I don't know that I necessarily think of potpourri as a pleasant smell. I've had some bad experiences with potpourri. I'm sure there's good potpourri out there. I've experienced some terrible potpourri. But it is designed to be a pleasing aroma to the Lord and to cover the mercy seat. And so just by chance, Zechariah gets chosen to pick 2 spadefuls of this aromatic incense ash and to carry it into the holy place, to put it on the incense altar. This is a once-in-a-lifetime experience. For somebody like Zacharias, it was not anticipated. Even though it's by lot, it's not anticipated that he will ever have this opportunity again. So, if he is a priest and he gets chosen by lot to take the incense in, this is the Super Bowl of being a priest. This is the most important thing he will ever do. And he goes into very piously, because we know, righteous before God, blameless before others. And everybody's going, isn't it great that Zechariah got picked? He's the one, man, so good for him. Well, he goes in, and it says that in a way that is incredibly surprising. He goes in, and it says, there appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing at the right side of the altar of incense. So he goes through that curtain and has that high, holy, sacred, personal experience where he is going to do his duty. And as he's walking to come light the Advent candle, and he's focused on his thing, all of a sudden, there's somebody standing in this holy place. And there's not supposed to be anybody in there. It's kind of like, a startle scare, where maybe you're focused on something and you walk into a room and you don't realize your spouse is right there, and you're like, oh my goodness. They're not trying to scare you. You just might be of the personality type that you're not very situationally aware, and then when you find out there's a person right next to you, there's a bit of a jump scare. It's terrifying. Before the angel even speaks, Zechariah is absolutely freaked out. And the angel's there for a very special reason. It's a gender reveal party, except the challenge is Zechariah doesn't even know that he's about to have a kid. And yet, Gabriel's here to say, you're going to have a son. His name's going to be John. Here's all these things about him that you need to know. And so, listen, it's fun to watch videos if you're on Facebook or you're on YouTube, all these crazy ways that people try to do their gender reveal. Fun little experiments that you. I don't think you're ever going to top an angel appearing and telling you exactly what's going to happen. Hey, by the way, you're going to have a son. What, I'm pregnant? It's crazy. And yet we find out that this is not different from a pattern that we see in the Old Testament. Angelic announcements of miraculous births happen to Ishmael, happen regarding Isaac, happen regarding Jacob and Esau, happen regarding Samson. What is unique about this revelation is that in just a few verses, Gabriel shows up again to Mary, is that many times the announcement is made to the mother. Yet in this case, maybe because he's a priest, the revelation is made to the father. And what does he say? He says, your prayer has been answered. And then he says, you're going to have a son. Now, what's interesting is we noted two concerns that they had. Their personal issue with their childlessness and their spiritual concern for the nation. As somebody who is blameless and righteous before God, he has to look at the moral condition of his contemporary society and just say, oh, dear God, when are you going to do something? When are you going to stop the tide of ungodliness? When are you going to answer us again? And we don't really know which prayer for a son, prayer for the nation, which is the prayer that Gabriel is saying is being answered. From the way that John is described as turning hearts back to the Lord, it seems to be that the prayer that Gabriel is saying that he's referring to is his prayer for the spiritual condition of the nation. I think with his recognition that they are both well beyond childbearing age, Zacharias and Elizabeth probably stopped praying for a kid years ago. I mean, you think if they're beyond childbearing age, they've been praying for decades. Hundreds of prayers. I mean, even if you just gave them one prayer a day, over decades. And I think that they had probably grown so discouraged that maybe this is just the lot that God had for them. They had prayed for many years. And yet in the angel's announcement that their prayer has been answered, the answer that they are about to find is far greater than they ever dreamed, because there are two gifts in one. Zacharias never would have dreamed that the birth of his son would have anything to do with the spiritual restoration of his nation, but God had a plan. God had something that he had planned from before Genesis 3. It's revealed in Genesis 3 that there would be a son born to Eve that would crush the head of the serpent. It's the very first promise of the gospel, worked out from before the foundation of the world. And Zacharias never would have assumed that his son would inaugurate the fulfillment of God's promise to the nation. But that's exactly the point, that this gift is two gifts in one. It's a gift within a gift. Their son would bring about the promise that God seemed to have forgotten. And their son is not the Messiah, but he is the forerunner of the Messiah. It says that he will go before him and make straight the way of the Lord, to prepare the people for Jesus' arrival. In verses 14 through 17, we're told at least three things about the son. In verse 14, we're told that this son will be a cause for celebration. That's certainly true for Zacharias and Elizabeth. They have prayed for this, and God at the 9th hour has answered their prayer. Listen, it would be a strange thing to be having a baby shower for a 70-year-old couple. But if it happened, we would rejoice. We would have some questions about how is this all going to work out. But man, what in the world is God up to? He would be celebrated. And it's not just a personal issue. He would be a cause for celebration for the pious people of God. They would see in John the Baptist's birth and John the Baptist's ministry, God being faithful to his promise. We're told not only that the Son will be a cause for celebration. In verse 15, we're told that he'll be a man of tremendous character. It goes into this, not drinking wine, not drinking strong drink, being filled, even from his mother's womb, with the Holy Spirit. There is something about the character of John the Baptist that will get people's attention. He will be celebrated. He will have character. And then verses 16 through 17, we're told that he will bring conviction. Verse 16 says it like this: he will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God. Why is he compared with Elijah? I don't really know, but I have a guess. John was kind of known as a rough character, as was Elijah. John the Baptist was known as a bold character, so was Elijah. But they both ministered, strangely enough, in times of drought. Elijah, with Jezebel, prayed and the heavens were shut up and it didn't rain until God saw fit to have Elijah pray for it to happen. John the Baptist ministers in a context of not a meteorological drought, but a theological drought. God had not spoken for 400 years. And John would be the last and the best prophet to ever arise. What's Jesus say about him? Among men, there's not been anyone quite like John the Baptist. That's a pretty high commendation from Jesus Christ. But I want you to stop for just a second. And before we get into the hustle and the bustle of a very busy Christmas season, I don't know if you know this, but if you're anything like me, it's very easy for you to get distracted. Anybody start something at home and then something else happens and then you forget, why am I in this room? Like, what did I come in here to do? Like, I was doing some home improvement projects, and I could not for the life of me remember where I had laid my tools. And I laid them on my in-laws' kitchen counter. I have no idea. I don't remember going in their kitchen, but my tools ended up on their kitchen counter, and I looked everywhere. Why is it what you're looking for is always in the last place that you look for it? So strange. It was there. And so it's easy for us to get distracted, and the truth is, even for people that want to love Jesus and make much of him this holiday season, it's easy to get distracted. So my question for you, and this is really a twofold question, is if John the Baptist's mission preceding the incarnation of Jesus was to turn people's hearts, where would you say your heart needs to be turned this morning? And the reason I say that is I know something about myself. And I know it because the scriptures say it. So I know it about you too, and you've never confessed this to me. The Bible says the heart is desperately wicked. Now, it's redeemed, but there's a battle that goes on between the new man in Christ and the old man in sin, in which we have to wrestle. That's part of the sanctification process. And I'm not asking for you to confess out loud where your heart needs to be turned. But the chances are your heart has gotten off of true north by maybe even just a couple of degrees. Are you focused on yourself and not so much on others? Have you made yourself an idol? Have you been too reliant on yourself or too righteous in your own eyes? Does your heart need to be turned towards sanctification? Are there things that you're playing with that you don't need to play with? Does your heart need to be turned towards serving God's people, towards reconciliation? There's probably 1,000 other things that we could fill that blank in with, right? But why would you wait? If John the Baptist's preceding work to the incarnation of Jesus was turning people's hearts, why would we think that we're exempt from needing our heart checkup and getting it in tune so that we can celebrate Jesus the way that we need to this holiday season? We see the importance of faithfulness demonstrated in Zechariah and Elizabeth's life. In verses 18 through 23, we see the importance of working through your doubts. Listen beginning in verse 18. And Zechariah said to the angel, "How shall I know this? For I'm an old man, and my wife is even older." My wife is advanced in years. That's a really nice way to say it. And the angel answered him, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I was sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. And behold, you will be silent and unable to speak until the day that these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time." And the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondering at his delay in the temple. And when he came out, he was unable to speak to them. And they realized that he had seen a vision in the temple, and he kept making signs to them and remained mute. And when his time of service was ended, he went to his home. Zechariah loves God. He's righteous. He's blameless. And despite the glory of this surprise announcement, Zechariah can't overcome biological facts. I mean, we already know they're old. They're past the childbearing years. And Zechariah just wants to make sure that Gabriel is like delivering the telegram to the right people. He's like, "I just want you to know, I'm old, and my wife is advanced in years." And Gabriel says, "You don't believe me. You don't believe me." Doubly childless. They've been praying for it, and yet it doesn't sound possible. So given Zechariah's incomprehension and disbelief, it's probable that his prayers have turned from praying for a son to praying for the restoration of Israel. In his time of waiting and his disappointment at not seeing his prayers for his son answered made him believe, this is crazy, this is wild to me, Zechariah actually believed that redeeming Israel was easier than a miraculous birth. God doing something for their family was more impossible than changing the moral degradation of their entire country. He said, saving our country, that's easy. 2 old people having a kid? No way. And yet he never would have dreamed that his son would be the beginning to the answer of not only his questions, but his questions about Israel's redemption. This demonstrates, and I think that this is a good thing, that even faithful people sometimes have doubts. Like, he's got to pay the consequences. He's deaf and mute. But it's temporary. Why? Because there's grace even in God's discipline. He could have been deaf and mute for the rest of his life. And that's not what God does to him. I think, by the way, it also teaches us to take care with what you say when you're surprised. So just because nobody else hears you say it, you're doing that woodworking project, you hit your thumb. What comes out of you is what's in you. When an angel shows up and says, "Hey, you're gonna have a kid," and you go, "No, not us." Be careful. Discipline yourself in your sanctification, that when even surprises happen, what comes out of you is glorifying to God. Because Zechariah doubted. He prayed, but he didn't believe. And his muteness and deafness were both a rebuke and a grace. And the truth is that sometimes our suffering makes us trust and appreciate God more. We'll see next week that Zechariah's mouth gets opened. Our sin and our disbelief shuts our mouth, and our faith finds a way to open it back up again. So if you find yourself hesitant to talk about Jesus, you might be a personality that doesn't want to be, like you're not a type A personality. I'm just going to let my light shine and not say any words. I will tell you, your mouth being closed when it comes to testimonies of who Jesus is might be based upon your personality, but the way that you rationalize not sharing what Jesus has done for you comes from no other source than sin. You have to speak about what Jesus did because your life's not clear enough. And the truth is, sin always shuts us up and faith always opens us up. So when we talk about your heart being turned, maybe you need to tell of the glorious things that God has done for you. Maybe you need to find a way to allow your mouth to sing the praises of God. Sometimes what most hinders our perception of God is our own expectation of what he will or will not do. God's perfectly capable of doing what God is going to do. But it's our perception and expectation of what he does that sometimes limits him. Fourth and finally, in verses 24 and 25, we see the importance of recognizing God's work. And this is the end of the story. It says, after these days, his wife Elizabeth conceived, and for 5 months she kept herself hidden, saying, thus the Lord has done for me in the days when he looked on me to take away my reproach among people. I find this fascinating because the story concludes noting that the issue that had been so personal and painful in her life has been resolved. Her shame is gone now that she has a child. And I want you to understand the mystery of how God works. We had a chance to talk about this in our core seminar this morning, talking about Job, about how it's so often that we make ourselves sovereign and we make God's sovereignty small. Like God's not allowed to do anything that we don't like. That's not true. And so many times we make ourselves the axis around which God's plan spins. That's not true. The axis around which God's plan spins is Jesus, not Scott, not Julie, not David, not Chris, not any of us. And yet God, in his just magnanimous, every good and perfect gift comes from the Father above. His plan is to send his Son to die for the sins of the world. And along the way, he takes care of Zacharias and Elizabeth that have prayed hundreds of more prayers than you have ever prayed for anything. And he gives them a son. Isn't it amazing sometimes to just see how God works in the world? It says after the temple encounter, there's no comment on the nature of hiding. I think, she knows it's going to be a bit of a scandal to be as old as she is and pregnant. So it likely means that she was just homebound. And it's interesting because she says, he has taken away my reproach among people. And I'm like, if he's taken away your reproach among people, then why are you hiding from the people? And I don't think it's this sense of like they're trying to hide God's blessings to themselves. I think they are withdrawing to prepare for what the angel has said is about to happen. The last and greatest prophet is going to be their son. They know their son's profession on the day that he's conceived. I got 2 sons. I'm still wondering how they're going to turn out, I got high hopes for them. I know some things that how God has wired them. I can't tell you what their profession's going to be. And it says, full of the Spirit from their mother's womb, and here's what he's going to do. He's going to be a man of character. He's going to turn their hearts back. And there's a sense in which Zacharias and Elizabeth are satisfied at seeing God's faithfulness, but there's more to it. Because John the Baptist's birth signals both God's renewed activity on behalf of Israel, his concern to be faithful to his promise, and meeting the personal needs of a righteous couple. That's not just one gift, it's 2. As God fulfills his plan, he has space and grace to give to people that have a personal need that's been very important to them. God's work is our work. Turning hearts, resolving doubts, blessing the faithful. Well, that's not just something that God does in Luke chapter 1. That's something God does every day. He turns hearts. Even yours. If you feel like there's no way for you to turn your heart, the best and easiest thing for you to do is give it to God. If you have doubts, if you're expressing doubts, the best thing for you to do is not gossip about them or talk to somebody else who doesn't know any more than you do. Take your doubts to God. If you wonder if God will be faithful, you can hear the laughter of Zacharias and Elizabeth as they ponder God's immeasurable grace at using their son to bless them personally as a family, but to begin this process of being faithful to the ancient promise that God has made to be mighty to save. And so God's work in Luke 1 is not one bit different than God's work today. The question is, what will be our experience of it? Will we turn it over to God and allow him to do his work. Would you pray with me, please?